Good afternoon, one and all. I'm very happy to be with you. And let's get started with globalization, petty trade between friends. Mouhoub will be our coordinator. He's an economist specialized in globalization, which is a very good thing, and head of the Paris Dauphine University, called also PSL. And Mouhoud will talk us through the situation. And then let me introduce the other speakers. Outstanding, Johanna, who's the Deputy Director General at the WTO, follows international trade for more than 25 years. Fauziah ZEN, who's the Principal Economist at AREA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, based in Jakarta, Indonesia. And then Yann LERICHE is also with us, who's the General Director for GetLink, or CEO of GetLink, a company that was known as Eurotunnel in the past. They operate the Channel Tunnel, and therefore what he's going to be talking about is going to be very interesting in terms of the new borders arriving in Europe. Now, Mouhoud will get us started. Good afternoon. Very happy to be here in Aix. Welcome to this panel. The title is perhaps a title that we could change and talk about petit meurtre entre amis, that is, friends killing each other. But let me talk about globalization very quickly, if you don't mind. And I'll set the stage, and I'll talk you through what the economists say is the situation today, and then I'll try and ask questions connected to our panel discussion. We have specialists with us, and we have different stakeholders who will be able to witness of these changes. To start with, well, globalization has entered a new phase, which is that it's more complex than ever. But it's not because it's complex that we can't explain things with simple words. During the second wave of globalization, the great globalization from 1945 till today, there were three waves, three different phases that were different altogether. The one from 1950 to 1990, more or less, based on globalization between industrialized countries, formerly industrialized countries. And then the second wave was that of hyperglobalization from 1990 to 2010. And it really ends in 2010. That was hyperglobalization. And that's when economies started to be very carbonized. They went together with the dilation, if I can say, of the global value chain to China based on different wage costs by units produced and a decrease in transportation costs. This led to hyperglobalization that has led us to the situation we're in today. And the political results, if you look at the middle classes today, and therefore many countries now are doing a number of things that it might lead them to a very difficult situation, including France. And then the third wave, the third phase that we'll be talking about is the one that started in 2010. So what you know today of what we call deglobalization, or at least reshuffling globalization, is not something that started with the COVID crisis, nor did it start with Ukraine, nor as well did it start with Trump being elected in 2016. These are aggravating factors. But after the super crisis in 2010, then globalization didn't come to a standstill. That is, globalization didn't collapse altogether, but we saw a sharp decrease in the dynamics of globalization. That means that during hyperglobalization from 1990 to 2010, trade increased twofold as quickly as global trade, or production, sorry, output. And then that's the main difference. What's it based on? It's economic factors. It's these reasons that have reshuffled the global value chain and the inshoring, outshoring of industrial activities, reshoring, de-risking. That's more recent, I know, but this is due to the fact that wage cost per unit produced, which is the right indicator to measure competitiveness, well, it's not the wage levels, it's the output cost or production cost per unit produced, that is, for each computer, for each bike, etc. Well, the cost were quite different between China, emerging countries, and industrialized countries. Now they're closer. Productivity gains, manufacturing productivity gains went up thanks to robotization in the northern industrialized countries. Salaries and wages didn't budge. just like salary to productivity ratios, which define the wage costs per unit produced. And on the other hand, what we have the reversal trend. That is, productivity is quite low, but salaries have skyrocketed in China, for instance. So wage costs per unit produced in the year 2000 were 40% of the unit cost in America for the emerging countries. That is, the emerging versus the industrial countries like the US was 40%. And then in 2018, it was 90 or 95%. It's not really a catch-up on the salaries, but it's salaries to productivity ratios. So the global chains were dilated, and then there was this reversal of a trend. The second one is transportation costs that also were going up. And what did this trigger? Well, the global value chains were reshuffled, fragmentation of production on a regional basis in the manufacturing industry. But at the same time, and that's why I'm saying it's very complex, what happened in the world of services is the other way around. With AI, for instance, we talked about AI this morning during one of our sessions, and therefore productivity gains were made in the service industry and all the jobs connected, that is in the manufacturing industry. 40% of the jobs are service-based or service jobs, and when we saw that we were reshoring manufacturing in the global north, then services were following hyperglobalization, as we'd never seen before. All the jobs connected to services are offshored. If you take Amazon and the Amazon robots, the new one, it's increased productivity gains by 5. So the Baumol law that was saying that productivity in services would remain a lot lower than in the manufacturing industry, well, we can challenge this law today. With hyperglobalization of services, we've seen that these two worlds are still connected, and they're still connected because it's not because trade is up again that globalization is going down. Because when you have customs tariffs, that's an aggravating sector. An aggravating factor, for instance, on cars with the Biden administration. That's new. When you have customs duties on top of the other duties like the most favored nation clause, that is the WTO rights, for the 2.5 duties for cars versus China, if you go up to 100%, it's going to completely reshuffle trade. But if you have customs duties that are very high or non-tariff obstacles or barriers that are very high, then what's going to happen is that you're going to have more FDIs. That's the second aspect of globalization. Foreign direct investments, they go beyond tariffs, that is, it's tariff jumping, and that's why I'm saying it's getting more and more complex. The jump above and beyond tariff and non-tariff obstacles. That's why we're not talking about deglobalization. Therefore, there are 3 questions that stem from that, because the 3 dates I mentioned, the 3 waves, the 4 ones, 2010, a slowdown of globalization. 2016, Trump was in power, in control, and then bilateralism was back in trade war, and then 2020, the COVID crisis, and then inflationary period, and then the war in 2022 in Ukraine. All of these will be aggravating factors, so much so that the economies will be more fragmented. What are the spin-off effects? Well, what's going to happen? Will we have globalization between friends? Will we focus on NATO countries? That will increase their trade among themselves on the basis of countries that will be decarbonizing more and more. Now, the authoritarian countries will be among themselves. India and China, by the way, have increased their trade with Russia a lot since 2022, multiplied by 5 between India and China, 100% increase between China and Russia. China and India and Russia. Therefore, we have more and more exchanges between the southern countries, and that could lead to 2 parallel globalization trends. Is it what we're witnessing or something else? And if you look at the other bloc, the NATO country bloc, there's fragmentation as well, due to the fact that politically there have been many changes, countries are focusing on their own nations. And what about the role of China when we're looking at this decoupling between them and the US? Is there real decoupling, or will China be the ultimate referee, and they will divert the Chino-American trade flows from Europe. Anyway, this is the general situation, which means that globalization has not entered a simple phase, but there's some type of complexification, if I can use the word, in globalization. But our different speakers will tell us what's happening on the ground, and they'll perhaps also share with us a number of solutions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mouhoud. No, that's really setting the stage. That's very interesting, and you have a lot of passion. Johanna, now, your turn. I think you're really well equipped and positioned because you are one of the leaders at the WTO, and you have this global view on what's happening today. That is the reshuffling we were talking about. What would you say about this? What are you seeing? Some type of reshuffling, as Mouhoud said in his introduction? Or have you seen perhaps globalization between friends, which is what he said?
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. Globalization has been dynamic. That is true in every way. And it's driven by a number of factors that I think you touched upon: transport and travel costs, information technology, trade and regulatory differences, including geopolitics, and governance quality of the host countries. And so, yes, post the financial crisis, we have seen certain trends that are affecting the rhythm of globalization. Trade growth has stagnated when compared to the global growth of GDP. We have seen an increase in unilateral trade restrictions, both on imports and in exports. And at the World Trade Organization, we have a number of councils and committees that look at this type of issue. And at the Council of Trade and Goods, for example, there has been a 9-fold increase of raising of trade concerns and a 4-fold increase in our Market Access Committee. So these are places where countries, members, address each other's concerns. And we have also seen a significant increase in new industrial strategies and subsidies that come along with it that bring risks, right, of spillovers, economic spillovers. They're a drain on financing, but at the same time, they also have the danger of affecting the smaller economies around the world and the developing countries. And so when we get down to the global value chains, these trends are also being seen. Economic factors, we see change in labor costs, we see changes in energy prices, availability of raw materials. Just for example, China's labor cost index rose by almost 38% between 2010 and 2021. Then we have digitalization, the adoption of new technologies, automation, robotics, and that is really also affecting global value chains. Digitally delivered services are one of the components of international trade that are growing significantly with an annual growth rate of 8.2% in the past 18 years. And also we see changes in consumer preferences and, of course, political instability. And so getting down to the geopolitical factors that are one of the major drivers of changes to global value chains, we see countries that are seeking, global value chains, sorry, companies that are seeking more resilience. And I think the COVID shock and other shocks to the supply chain in the recent years have driven down this even harder. And so companies are looking for local suppliers, developing local suppliers, diversifying their supply chains. And we're also seeing how AI is also being used in many ways to be able to handle global value chains in a better way. So what's coming next? What's the outlook, the future? I think the changes to global value chains, to globalization are going to continue. Definitely they're going to go faster even. But not all changes will be bad. We actually see some opportunities. And at the World Trade Organization, we call it re-globalization. It is an opportunity to include different groups in the benefits of globalization that did not benefit from the past waves that you mentioned. Who are these groups? More women. So we're working very hard at the World Trade Organization to include more women in the benefits of trade. MSMEs should benefit more. Youth should benefit more from the opportunities that trade brings. And the developing countries, obviously, should benefit more. So if global value chains are looking to new opportunities and how they can diversify, Well, we think that the developing world and other groups are a great opportunity for inclusion, and we call that reglobalization.
Merci. Madame Fauziah.
Thank you very much. Madam Fauziah ZEN, we'd like to listen to you. What's your take on that? What would you say about the reshuffling of globalization? Is it re-globalization, as was said by the WTO representative? What have you seen? What are you witnessing? Would you say what Mouhoud said, that is a reshuffle based on blocks? That's what he called globalization between friends. Would you say that or not? And what are the effects, the impacts of this reshuffle that you might have seen in the field, in trade?
Thank you very much for the questions and opportunities. I cannot agree more to Johanna that what we are facing now is a dynamic positions, yeah, and it's continuously changes. And not all changes are bad. Some are creating opportunity, yeah, to the new players or to the recompositions of the new trade partnerships. But I would like to highlight like 3 consequences of this globalization or trade, not globalization, but trade tensions, yeah, that currently happens. First, that protectionism hurt many economic players. It hurts businesses by reducing its competitiveness. It hurts workers and households by reducing their purchasing powers. So it's not a win-win solution, actually. And the second one is the attack on the trade policy, especially to a big country, will result in retaliations. Like as we seen what happened between US and China, for example. And it affects not only the direct partners, trade partners, but also indirect trade partners. And the third one, that the short-term benefactors of the trade tensions may be not the true winners, since there are costs in that positions. For example, it will add more costs because of the uncertainty in the business. It also because of the additional cost of the risk mitigations as well as the inflationary pressures, for example. And the situation may have various results in the long-term outcomes. So one thing, for example, that Ukraine-Russia war has created energy crisis in Europe, but then policy and market response in Europe can reduce the reliance of the Europe on the Russian energy. Then it's quite good to some extent. But then if Europe policy put stricter or restricting requirement to the other developing partners of the market energy, then the global south may face the obstacle in doing the business with Europe and may find other suitable partners to do so. So that's the dynamics continues, and what we see that the changes, yeah, the continuous changes. What happened now? The winners today may not be the winners tomorrow.
Alors,
kind of like
si vous me permettez,
If I may, I'd like to pick on this with you, Fauziah ZEN, again, because in the public conversation, what the economists say is that if we look at the winners, there are some ASEAN countries that are the winners, the region that I suppose you know best. And you're coming from Jakarta, especially to be here at the Rencontres Économiques d'Aix-en-Provence. What would you say about this? Would you say that the ASEAN countries are amongst the biggest winners in this reshuffle? And could you tell us more about this, please?
Thank you. And yeah, to some extent. But again, yeah, for example, when Trump administrations put tariff on the Chinese goods flowing into U.S., China's export market declined, right, to the U.S. and Europe, but then turned into the East Asian neighbors, including especially Vietnam, actually. Vietnam, Thailand, and also in some extent Indonesia. And then if the policy and market in East Asia responds to expand the manufacturing exports to Europe and as well as to North America. By utilizing these cheap intermediate goods coming from China, then actually the ASEAN could be the winner, including China, because now China can reroute their exports to US and Europe by using these manufacturers' plants in the East Asia, kind of like that.
Ok, très intéressant. Les gagnants.
Now that's very interesting. The winners are not the ones we might think are the winners. Yann LERICHE, what about you? You are the CEO of GetLink. And I think you experienced something that not many have, that is a unilateral decision made by a country to close a border. That is deglobalization, to use the word, or Brexit, that is. And this has had a direct impact on your business. Could you perhaps tell us more about this and the very tangible impacts for you on your business when the border was closed, if I can use the word border, that is between the UK and Europe, the rest of Europe? That's true. At GetLink, we manage Eurotunnel, the Channel Tunnel. And, well, this is a tunnel that everybody knows. We manage infrastructure, but also on our trains we have all the vehicles, the trucks that go from the UK to Europe, Europe to the UK. 25% of the cargo on trucks goes through the tunnel, which means that we have a vantage point to talk about this. Now, Brexit has changed the deal, that's true. The first thing I'd say about this is that the British economy today is not doing that well. They're not really doing well. But it's difficult to measure the impact of Brexit because it happened when COVID struck, so an impact on all economic indicators. But a few years down the road, we'd say that the UK economy is the very last one in terms of growth if you look at the G7 countries. Now, let me try and share two lessons I can derive from that, which I quite like because nobody had foreseen them. And these are, and therefore we had to look at those and study what was going on. The first lesson we draw is that the non-tariff barriers are much more terrible than the tariff barriers. When Brexit was announced, everybody said not many products will be having their own levies, taxes, or quotas. And that's true. Less than or fewer than 10% of trade exchanges have these levies and taxes. But to justify the fact that this trade will not be subject to these taxes and levies, you have to fill in quite a lot of papers. And that's a lot of paperwork. And that means extra costs that are assessed at 10% of total exchange of goods in the trade of goods. And that's the reason why, in terms of goods trade, we're not back to the position we had before Brexit. 4 years later, we're still at minus 15%. The second conclusion I'd draw from that is that the ones that decide to be out, that is the UK, from a tariff union, suffer more than those who remain in the group. I've said 15% trade that decrease, but this is not symmetrical. Europe exports usually 10% less to the UK, and the UK exports 20% less to Europe. So minus 15 is an average between minus 10 and minus 20. This is also something we'd not expected, so we had to look into this with the London School of Economics, and they highlighted something very interesting, which is if you're a corporation in Europe and you export throughout Europe, including the UK, and that's before Brexit, well, if things were difficult, that is, exporting to the UK because you had non-tariff barriers, then you would stop your exports to the UK. You might lose some of your export trade, but not much. You can still survive and do your own business. But if you were a UK company, and if in your value chain, in what you buy, you have a key supplier in Europe, then even though there are non-tariff and tariff barriers, if you have to say, we'll no longer work with this supplier because they're not competitive, you have to find another one. You have to source elsewhere, source further away in another country that's far away with tariff conditions that should be better than the ones we have between Europe and the UK. And that is awfully difficult to do. That's why the UK companies have continued to get their supplies from Europe. This is an imbalance that nobody expected, and therefore today France is lucky because the trade balance is positive with the UK. And this trade balance has continued to increase last year in 2023. What we saw is a record number in terms of the trade result between France and the UK. So it's even more positive than before. Mouhoud, please. Now back to you. I'd like to ask you something. We used the word protectionism earlier on. I know that not many people use the word nowadays. Now it's back on in the political stage. It seems that it's the solution that everybody uses, regardless of the parties. Could you tell us more about this, please? Why would we have more protectionism today? What are the reasons? What would the impacts be, the impacts of these measures, that is? Well, let me give you a good example. We don't want to be too theoretical. The effect of tariff protectionism, as you said, is less dramatic than non-tariff protectionism. During the whole period that I was talking about, that is multilateralism, backed by the WTO, well, we saw that bilateralism and regionalism was going up. And that's why perhaps WTO had a leadership to regulate global trade. So multilateralism was growing and the regions were fighting back with their own unions, customs unions, regional unions to exclude other countries, plus bilateral countries, for instance, with Canada and Europe. And the non-tariff barriers, they continued to increase and in large numbers. And even when we decided to get rid of all the barriers between the countries in the EU, we worked on that at that time. The economists worked on that, and they considered that there was still the equivalent, let me say, in terms of non-tariff barriers and the border effects, the equivalent of 30% of tariffs, the equivalent of tariffs. So borders have not disappeared. That was done between Canada and the US when the borders no longer existed. There was the NAFTA agreement, and the trade between Canada at the border with the US didn't really increase. Trade was 40 times higher between the Canadian provinces than with the US. So that's the border effect that lingered due to a series of factors. But if I look at the US and China, there's a decoupling, but since 2016, and this continued with the Biden administration, there were very high tariff peaks on the basis of a clause called, well, no, let's not share, it's the 301 Act to be added to the usual tariff barriers. And what we saw in the US and China is that this didn't have a very negative impact on American economy. On the contrary, it led to a diversification of sourcing because, economy is quite complex. It's not because you're going to have a tariff barrier with China that trade will stop with the neighboring countries. So there are Asian countries that will export the goods, the manufactured goods from the Chinese raw materials that will go to the neighboring countries and will flow to the US. So what we've seen is a strong diversification in American supplies coming from the rest of the world, which means that this decoupling was, well, vanished more or less in a whole series of new export flows. So the effects were not very negative. That's a report presented by the trade representative from the US, but there are very negative impacts on the consumers that we can still see. Costs are going up, and also we've seen, how can I say, very negative effects on the production lines. If you go too far with protectionism, if you look at the manufacturing goods, pharmaceutical goods, for instance, we're not certain that you can gain sovereignty from that. I know it's very complex, but please remember the other session we had on protectionism before. Well, you see, I think we've entered this world where multilateralism, backed by the WTO, is something that's very much challenged by bilateralism. And with Trump back in power, this will continue. I think what's happening in Europe is not better. I think today, if the nationalisms or nationalist parties were to consider that we want to gain power everywhere in Europe, I'm not certain that Europe would not fall apart as well. So geopolitically speaking, the situation is very complex, and this aggravates the effects I mentioned before that are objective effects of globalization. I quite agree with what was said earlier on. That is, we're not looking at complete deglobalization, but reglobalization in different regions.
I wanted Johanna to react to what was just said, and maybe to talk about another question, which is the question of this hyper-globalization that is quite paradoxal of services to which we're watching now, and that is amplified by AI.
I do think the issue of fragmentation, a possible fragmentation, is an important one. And we have been studying that at the World Trade Organization. And we can look at it from three perspectives. There's the merchandise trade or goods fragmentation. Also, we can have a fragmentation on foreign direct investment flows, as you mentioned. And another aspect that we haven't really talked about much today, but is on flows of data, right? That is a fuel for the new economy. And in there also is a danger of fragmentation, that some of it can come from geopolitics or strategic competition, and others might come just simply by different approaches to regulation. So we might get like a spaghetti bowl that we get in the goods, with different rules of origin. In the case of data, if we have many different regulations, it is going to be hard for enterprises to comply with the requirements of the different markets. And so in 2023, we published our annual World Trade Report, and in that we looked at the issue of fragmentation. And we found that since July around 2018, bilateral trade in goods between China and the US has grown more slowly than the trade that each country has done with the rest of the world. And so then we have more geopolitical influences coming in with a Russian invasion on the Ukraine, and that has deepened geopolitical divisions maybe into blocks. So we started looking into hypothetical blocks by following the voting patterns at the UN and seeing how these blocks have traded amongst each other. And we do see that trade has grown 4 to 6% more slowly amongst these two blocks than the trade within each block. So there is that danger in fragmentation in the goods side. And then looking at foreign direct investment, the flows are also aligning more on geopolitical lines, with less capital flowing from the developed countries to those countries that are maybe more geopolitically distant economies. And this trend is definitely more pronounced between 2018 to 2021 than it was before. And FDI fragmentation would obviously then affect global value chains and the flows of trade later on. And in the case of data, we have also been looking at the possible impact of fragmentation in that area. And this is a really important issue because at the WTO, our research shows that the future of trade is in services. It's digital, as our Director General, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala says. It's digital, it's green, and it should be inclusive. And it is the future of trade because that's what's growing. This is where the growth is. Sometimes we over-concentrate in looking what happens to the trade flows of goods, and we don't look at what's happening in services. And really, the growth that we are seeing is explosive, and it's going to get bigger. And then that creates great opportunities if you look at globalization in that sense, and to bring many more countries and many more groups within economies into the trade development cycle. And at the basis of it is the digital transformation and the possibility that AI could bring more growth into the world's economy might be affected by data fragmentation. And so that is something that I think we should all keep an eye on to see how we can, continue to use trade to bring in more peoples and more economies into the benefits.
Madame Fauziah ZEN, peut-être voulez-vous réagir?
Madame Fauziah ZEN, maybe you want to react to what was said, and maybe I'd like to ask you this question. We wondered who could win from this reshuffle, but we didn't ask who could be the loser of this reshuffle. Countries, of course, but consumers as well, because the reshuffling of the value chain could lead to inflation. Does it lead to inflation? Is it inflationist? Is it one question I wanted to ask you?
Thank you. I think one of the things that also quite important to be considered is the mega agreement right now, like the RCEP. It's the second largest after EU, right? And it already takes the effects. And also I agree that there are modern drivers nowadays, the data, the sustainable factors like decarbonizations and also AI, etc. Then it will also influence and contribute to these dynamics of this de- and re-globalizations. And well, if the question is about the inflations, if these trade tensions create inflation, and yeah, short explanation is yes, because the previously free market or free trade area or agreement that was quite efficient now become fragmented or restricted, then it will create inefficiency. And one of the impact is like inflation, higher level of the inflations. And it will take some time, yeah, for the market and policy makers to respond to manage this higher than anticipated inflation rate, yeah. And yeah, the direct the direct affected is the consumers. Yeah, we know that the U.S. Tariff into the Chinese goods, yeah, already inflated the domestic price in U.S. And even though to some extent, for example, when the Obama administrations banned or applied a very high tariff on tire from China to U.S., in the short term, the U.S. seen the increasing employment in the tire manufacturers, but because of the prices of tire and other related commodities also increase, then it hurts the purchasing powers of the workers as well as the household. Then it led to the retail sectors that suffer a setback with the employment losses. So the economic works in the linkages, yeah, one another. So we cannot just get everything and then nobody will lose something. But again, what I would like to mention that we need to see the period of the observations. So the short term and medium term, it could result in different winner and losers. Like we see, yeah, the whole stories is the continuous changes and how it affect. And one last thing, that if we see the world, the largest world exporters in the world, it's the same. I mean, let's say that the 10 top, yeah, it's the same with the largest importer, right? So it means that they are linked each other. The largest exporters are also the largest importers. So how could they can get everything? The winner takes it all and the loser takes all. I don't think so. Yeah. So yeah. Thank you.
Yann LERICHE, vous avez tout à l'heure.
Yann LERICHE, you mentioned the two main takeaways from Brexit. But now I would like you to explain them very concretely and explain the impact that this decision had on your business and how you managed to take benefits from it to improve some processes and make some process smoother. how can a society faced with a unilateral decision such as the one that you had to face can adapt? Brexit, tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers, it implies for the importers, exporters, and companies who are going to sell in a country that is not their home country, new forms to fill. We talk about customs forms, but there's tons of forms. For health products, we have some specific processes. For the fetal health, there's some products for safety. There's some forms. When Great Britain leaves Europe, it also leaves the VAT area, so there's different forms to be filled, and that's a lot of different steps. Our job was to help them as much as we could and to create new services, and that led us to grow new businesses to keep our clients. So services activity, yes. Yes, and the fact of doing the forms for them, to taking care of all the paperwork for them. If you want to export to Great Britain, we're going to explain to you exactly what you need to do, and it's a full package of services to transport and also to make sure that they can cross the border, having respected all the regulation in place. Beyond that, these rules that may appear a bit theoretical, we have to get back on the ground and mean what does it mean concretely when you cross the border. So you have to imagine yourself a truck that arrives in the north of France, in Calais, that wants to go to Great Britain by crossing the channel through the tunnel. And this truck is going to arrive in one of our terminals, and the driver will have to have a stack of papers, all these forms filled out for customs form, one paper by type of goods that he transports, and there's a QR code on each paper, and each of them will have to be scanned. And of course, he shouldn't be missing out on any single paper or having spilled his coffee on this piece of paper, because otherwise he won't be able to use it. And some of the goods, of course, are perishable, so he may take the risk of losing his whole truck of goods. And then they're going to ask him questions to the driver. Did you add some goods along the way? Are you transporting dangerous products? There's a whole list of check. We can see that logistically it doesn't work very well. If one paper is missing, it blocks the whole process. So of course, in terms of exchanges, it's not really good. So what we did is we made this whole process digital. Our clear ambition is to create the smartest border in the world between the UK and all the other countries in the world. And with the digital services, how does it work with all our clients? We recuperate all of their documents, so we check them to make sure that they have not left out anything. And when the truck gets to the border, we recognize the license plate, and we, by APIs, digital channels, we send this information to the servers of the British customs and the French customs. And we have a very good relationship with both authorities. We didn't imagine that we could interact so directly with the customs services. And there's a commitment on both sides of the channel to make sure that during the crossing takes about 35 minutes for a truck to cross the channel on a train. Authorities on both sides say, with the documents that I received at the entrance of the tunnel, everything is going to go well, or I'm going to do a thorough check or a physical check when the truck arrives there, and we notify to the driver who will stop or who will carry on if he doesn't need to be checked. So this smart border was the answer that we provided, because, as I said, beyond all the major economic concepts, there's a reality of the ground that is very strong. There's some truck drivers who bring from one country to the next the goods, and that completely changed the logistics chain of operators. Thank you very much. Maybe a word of conclusion of Professor Mouhoud, and also how do we set the place of Europe? Because we haven't talked about it that much in this reshuffle. I don't want to wrap up, but I want to rebound on what has been said by the three speakers. We shouldn't be a victim of what tariff protectionism represents. And what has happened in the last few years is the the subsidies that are coming back. You see what's happening in the U.S. with the IRA. We're talking about billions of dollars. In Europe, it's a little less because, well, we cannot come up with such amounts. China as well. If you look at the trend and all the tariff barriers and you look at the very top and you have the subsidies. So the real trade war is happening on the pre-competition field, on how to fund research or how to fund industry. That's a real challenge for the years to come. And I would like to end on, open the discussion to if you have tariff barriers of very high on the vehicles, 100% on vehicles coming from China, you're going to have some retaliation. But people are going to retaliate. But let's look at this survey from this French Center of Prospective Studies. This study shows that most of the sales of cars are made on a national model or intracontinental model. So 6% of cars sold in the world come from a national plant, 18 from a plant on the same continent, and only 16% of a plant that comes from a different continent. So at the end of the day, as soon as you have tariff barriers, the foreign investment drops, and we tend to invest on the spot in the country. So it's not because we have crazy, because you have 100% tariff, customs tariffs. It's that's the real stakes of the globalization are on the way of invest directly abroad, like you said, on different fields. And that is the proof, the evidence that globalization hasn't slowed down. It's just become more and more complex, and economies are linked to each other's, and the economic independence is quite irreversible today. And we need to say that because we need to change the bracket. There's trade, and then there's also the production movements that are a different bracket. And if you put it in relation to what I said about the fact that it's subsidies to industry that are the main factor of the commercial tool, then you get the idea that we shouldn't be a victim of what's happening on trade. There's another question that remains with WTO is how can the WTO can fix up the world, particularly from with its organ of dispute solving. What do you do about that? I think we need to ask the WTO, what do you do in a world where you're going to have some forces against the WTO, particularly if Trump comes back to power. So thank you very much. We're going to let the people in the room ask a number of questions. 5 minutes very quickly. Yann LERICHE wanted to bring his opinion to a fundamental question, which is the climate topic, because as a rail operator, you are very committed to that. And if we have a reshuffle of globalization that is a bit more concerted on this type of global questions, such as climate change, is it something that you wish for? Well, in any event, I'm going to react to what was said. We have talked a lot about globalization, protectionism. That's sovereignty is now the buzzword. Sovereignty means that you don't depend asymmetrically from another country. And the round table of today, small trade between friends. I don't want to depend on the other people, and I want to remain free. And we're caught between this tension between I don't want to depend on others, but I want to do trade with others and grow. And I think that would miss a very important point if we didn't talk about climate, because climate changes the dynamic and can even change the view of having this small trade between friends. So I'm going to give you the works of William Nardos, the Nobel Prize of Climate, as an example. Climate is a global subject, and that is affected by affecting everyone, and everybody would like others to stop emitting, but we don't have a world governance on that. We don't really know how to get out of the problem, and the best proposition that he made, he said we should create some climate clubs, like the rich countries that can afford it, among themselves. They would tax the products that would emit a lot of carbon, and they would create a border, like a carbon tax at the border, not to protect themselves, but to inspire the rest of the world to want to trade with them in a logic of global impact and not a protection. And what is very interesting is the European policy was based on this principle. The CBAM tax is the border, the carbon tax at the border, and the Americans last week have said that they consider very seriously, for those reasons, to apply a carbon tax at the border as well. So this little trade among friends can be also seen at 180 degrees and lead to global reflections based on local initiatives. And I find this very interesting. Thank you to all our speakers for this very interesting panel with many questions and many new questions that I would like to ask. We're going to take a few from the room. If you have questions, please feel free. I believe a micro is being passed on. Yes. Thank you very much. You talked about goods. You talked about services. You talked about direct investment. But that doesn't account for all the exchanges. And you haven't talked about portfolio investment. You haven't talked about banking credit flows. But if we look at it from a macroeconomic point of view, the problems that we may have on exchanges of goods and services could lead to imbalance of current operations, so that those will have to be financed. So the question of capital is important. And in the diagnosis that you make, what's going to happen with capitals? Johanna Hill, do you think you would want to take this question?
One of the works that we do at the World Trade Organization is try to work on a coherence mandate with the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank and IMF. And during our annual conversations, we have noted how capital flows have drastically fallen in the case of the developing world, for example. And in the case of the World Trade Organization, what 3/4 of our membership have been doing, for example, is working on an investment facilitation for development agreement. And basically, this is an agreement that looks to cutting red tape and easing the way we do business in developing countries by increasing transparency, fighting corruption, developing local providers' database to integrate them into the economy. So that awareness is there. And from the World Trade Organization standpoint, some of the work that is being done is on the coherence mandate. Trade finance is also an issue that we have investigated a lot. We see, of course, that there is a lack of trade finance, especially for the developing world. And our research shows that more work needs to be done in that area by the group of institutions.
Mouhoud, vous vouliez intervenir?
Mouhoud, you wanted to say something? Yes, the trade of goods and maybe services. The globalization falls into 5 elements: trade, direct investment abroad, finance, global finance, knowledge, and patents, and international migration. So if you make a macro measure of those dynamics, you realize that they don't all go in the same direction. So direct investment is continuing, finance continues to be extremely dynamic. It's the premium for risk on the capital movements remained very low, which is not the case on goods nor on international migrations. That are the movements, the flows where the costs are the highest, and for knowledge throughout research and development and patents, the dynamic is very strong with delocalizations since digital and AI, and the fact of providing services from a distance. So there's a very strong dynamic there. That's why I'm very careful. And I want to raise a red flag against this idea of deglobalization, because it's not necessarily true. We just witness a complexification of the globalization. We're going to take a second question from the room. If somebody wants to ask a question. Anybody? Well, in this case, we're right on time, so I think we're going to wrap up the session, and we're going to thank our panelists. Thank you very much. So please give them a warm round of applause for Fauziah ZEN, Johanna Hill, Yann LERICHE, and Mouhoud. It is just the beginning of the great conversation we'll have on this next year's